Welcome to Local Digital Live, our discussion programme exploring some of the key issues in the digital drive to transform local services. Our current series is focusing on smart, as in, is smart just for cities or does it apply to places as well? The answer to that one in a previous programme was actually it applies to all local authorities and all localities. Do smart citizens demand smart services? Well, yes, and increasingly citizens are seeing smart as, well, normal. So today we're going to look at how do we build the smart foundations? What technologies and solutions and digital solutions will help local services build the foundations to deliver smart services and smart operations? As ever, during the discussion, we like you, our audience, who are watching us live, to join in. Please submit questions through the instant messenger facility on your screen, and also please vote in the polls that we're putting up, and tell us your thoughts as well. So today, here in the studio, I'm joined by Matt Payne, who's the Associate Partner at KPMG, Paul McPherson, who's the Director of Public Sector at Microsoft Business Solutions in the UK, and John Thornton, who's a SIP for Council member. Thank you for joining me. First off, let's have some quick thoughts. What makes a city smart? What is smart? Is it just digital, just technology, or is it more than that? John?
Well, I don't think there's any one definition of smart. Everybody seems to use it to cover whatever their agenda is. So whether it's being about greener, whether it's using big data, Wi-Fi, smart transport. But for me, the common element is the aspiration and application of technology to improve efficiency, provide a greener city and a more sustainable city.
Matt?
I agree with everything John said there. I think the thing for me, in addition to that, is it's about choice. Doing things either the most efficient way, the most effective way, or the way that you most want to. Things like Hills Are Alive in Bristol. What's the most fun way for you to do something?
I think for me, I would just add to what's been said by both the gentlemen in that it's all of those things, and choice is very, very important. There's no one size fits all. But also it's connecting people. It's connecting people with each other. It's connecting people with where they live, the facilities in their area. And technology, big data, digital, all the things that sit below that, all the things that get pulled together into that area, then they should very much be seen as enablers. It's not about those. It needs to be about the people.
So it's about people, and it also seems to be about, choice. I like the idea of the agenda. So you think people are using that as a kind of buzzword as well?
I think it's fairly common for cities that either want to drive inward investment, the green agenda, perhaps a better transport system. It's quite convenient to call it a smart city, and then it covers a whole range of things. So I think a lot of people are adapting the term just to cover their own agenda. And a lot of it's about dealing with their own pressures, because basically, whether you're a city in the UK or whether you're in South America or Asia, you've got all sorts of problems, and really most are going to need technology to help them solve those problems, one way or another.
So let's go back as well to, Paul, what you were saying about it's everything that's underneath it, the big data, because actually that's what I wanted to look at today, is the foundations. How do we build those foundations? We did a survey recently with local authorities and local services looking at what makes a city or a place smart and how far along they are with these things. And, nearly 8 in 10 already have or are developing integration of back office systems with citizen-centred services. They've got effective, they've got procurement systems in place. They're developing HR systems. And it seemed that they all thought, the majority thought, that this was part of being smart. What's your view on that? Does that make the foundation or the core? Matt?
That makes the local authority smart. I don't think that makes a smart place. I think for it to be a smart place or a smart city, the whole of the public sector needs to be operating in that way, and the private sector and the physical infrastructure. So it's a necessary starting point, but it's not the whole answer.
Coming back to what I said right at the beginning, that all those things are enablers, and they're part of getting a foundation right. But as Matt says, that's making the authority or an organisation smart, and that's not necessarily meaning that citizens and those people consuming services would actually agree or disagree. So
do they need to know about those smart foundations?
I don't think they need to know, but then obviously the proof is in the pudding, and they
Yeah.
need to feel the difference. If they can consume services or be provisioned in new modern ways that suits how they live, how they communicate, the channels that they prefer to use in the places that they prefer to use them, then that is a true judge of success, rather than whether a system is purely being upgraded or new modules added, or those low binary things.
So actually, I'd like to put up the first poll now. Perhaps you could join in. The first one is, does SMART refer to the external environment, to citizens and places, or to the internal organisations' operations when we're talking about smart foundations? So there's a little poll coming up. It's external, internal, or both. If you could just quickly give us the answers to that. John, can I bring you in on that one? So what do you think?
Well, I think one of the things about being a smart organisation, a smart city, is actually it's about really driving fundamental change. And if you're talking about HR systems, basic systems, you need to have those in place. But actually, it's very difficult to get people to sort of buy into a vision of, I'm going to have the greatest HR systems. It's much more about what the technology does to deliver for people. So it's how you make smarter services. How do you make the transport system better? How do you help it to enable healthier citizens? How do you help the elderly with some of the problems they'll encounter? And so I think if we talk about smart as basic application systems, I think large parts of the population, large parts of our employees actually switch off. We've actually got to be at that point where we can explain the bigger vision, the bigger picture, and how all of that plays into it.
Do you think that's the view of the finance director? Obviously, CIPFA is the Chartered Institute of Finance Professionals in the public sector. So do you think that's how finance directors would view it? That this is I've done HR, that's fine. Does that sell into the vision? Would they connect with that?
I think they would. For finance directors, they're a pretty hard-nosed bunch, public or private sector. And really, it's the business case that drives it. What are the benefits? What are the costs? What are the risks? What are the rewards? But that needs to be set within the context of, what's the bigger vision? What is it we're trying to achieve? And that means there's some thought leadership where you need to bring in politicians, chief executives, directors of finance. And actually, a lot of this is about what's that overall vision, and then what are the components that help us to achieve it. And if the vision is it's a cleaner, more pleasant environment, that's great. If it's we're going to bring all of this external investment and turn this into a really high-tech city that brings in biotech and sort of the next Silicon Valley, then you need that vision that underpins what you're trying to do, which makes it understandable for everybody involved why they need those basic foundations to underpin it.
Just audience poll back in, 87% say it's both, internal and external. So that's...
I'd agree with that.
Yeah, okay. So what about the building those... Can you deliver the vision, if you don't have the building blocks right? And does it matter whether you've got 20-year-old HR systems, or is there a means of enabling people to work better in the smart vision?
I think they are important foundation blocks. They're not the be-all and end-all, but an authority needs to be open for business to play its part in that smart place, that smart city. And if it can't deliver on its own business, I don't see how it can be open for business with the rest of the place.
Cool.
I'd agree, and in getting ready or in building a strong foundation or core, then there should, for the finance director and for the management team of that organisation, there should be opportunities to bring in early stage efficiency and productivity gains, cost savings, and as John's sort of referred to, they are very traditional. That's doing things quicker and easier with more modern systems. They're not enabling a smart city, but it is putting the strong foundation, and it's removing those layers of legacy that maybe prevents organisations from being far easier to do business over digital channels, for instance. There is the opportunity to automate processes by doing that, and all of that should when done properly, deliver a far more consistent, fast and efficient service for citizens that consume those services.
What about for the finance director? You say that, yes, a bit hard-nosed, looking at, in the age of austerity, how do you get them to buy into that vision? Maybe they don't see that vision. What do you need for an organisation to have in place so that you can use business intelligence modelling, so you can look at future scenarios, that you can use big data? How important, all the things that you would want to use as a smart organisation externally with your citizens and with other organisations, public and private sector in the locality. How do you get them to understand the need for that then, or to invest in those? What hooks would you do if you were explaining to your finance director why you need to have modern systems so you can be agile, flexible, responsive? What would make the finance director sit up and take notice if the vision of being smart is not the day job?
I think it's also about smart governance. You can put smart in front of anything, can't you? But
I do like this idea of it being an agenda. I mean, yes.
Well, if you think in terms of smart governance, if you're going to have a smart city, a smart organisation, actually the governance is about the performance management, it's about the vision, it's about customer insight, it's about evidence-based planning. Big data gives you the opportunity to do that evidence-based planning. It gives you the ability to drive customer insight, to begin to look at better ways of doing it. It also means that you can, and we're obviously at the really early stages of using big data for a lot of public sector things, but if you really dig into the big data, then you can begin to look at cause and effect. And once you understand cause and effect, you begin to say, well, if we invest more in this area, we can reduce the adverse impacts of things in another area. Barcelona, for example, is one of Barcelona's objectives is to get information and data feeds from all of the sensors in the city. So they don't want to control everything, but they'd certainly like to know what's going on. So by collecting all of that data, even if they don't know how they're going to use it, they've got that data to dip into, to begin to model, and to begin to, as they implement individual policies, to get feedback about how it's working, whether it's having the desired effect. And I just think we need to be smarter about all of those things in terms of not only how we develop the vision and the plan, but how we monitor it, how we work out whether we're going in the right direction, and if we work out whether we could invest our money in better ways to achieve the objectives that we have.
I mean, there's no denying the logic of that, but there's not a lot of evidence about that at the moment. And in the survey, over 3/4 of respondents felt that big data to handle, to address complex challenges and for data analytics to predict service demand, over 3/4 felt that this was important, but less than 1 in 5 authorities or organisations are doing this because there is no evidence of the benefit, and actually it's quite costly. I mean, rolling out in Barcelona a citywide sensor network, that's an expensive investment, and as you say, they're not sure yet what they're going to do with it.
Yeah, but
that's a difficult sell in austerity.
The smart bit is not the city financing all of that. The smart bit is saying those sensors already exist. They're often owned by other agencies, private sector.
Yeah.
How do we collect that data and use it and bring it together? And a lot of this is not about doing it all yourself. It's about collaboration, taking advantage of what's already there, and working with big, smart organisations that have experience from other sectors and other countries.
Matt, I'll come to you in a minute, Paul.
Sorry,
Sorry.
it is about providing access to that data set. It doesn't then mean that the local authority needs to do all of the work. Some of the most successful places are where they've held hackathons and let the universities get involved in the area. It doesn't have to be the authority investing.
I think what's really important, and building on what John was saying, that with regard to sort of sensors in Barcelona and other places, virtually any town, city, major conurbation, there are many that are already there. And it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of joining things up. And then things like big data just become an enabler to enable you to do that. I think where many people fall foul of big data is trying to consciously do it. And the same as anything else, you need a use.
Feel the force instead.
Well, we're going to do big data now,
Yeah.
and it's a solution looking for a problem. Whereas, you know, you need to have a use case the same as you would in delivering anything else, a strategy, a vision, some measurable things that you want to achieve that you can actually go back and say, what did we learn? Did we partly or fully or over exceed on what we wanted to find out? And, you know, joining existing data sets together that are, you know, available right now through across various different organisations, both public and private sector, then, you know, there are, you know, valuable use cases there that need to be exploited, rather than saying we're just going to do some big data now. What do we need to buy? What are we going to do with it?
There's a question coming from Spencer Newsham on the same point, saying how much does the panel think that big data can be useful if the big question isn't understood? And I think, would the panel agree that the question's already being asked by the citizens, customers, victims, patients? How do public servants ensure that they're smart enough to listen? That's quite an interesting take on it. So what are the big questions, and how do we ensure that our public servants have the tools to be able to understand that and use it? John?
Well, I think you don't start by saying what are the big questions. You start by what actually are we trying to achieve. So if you say one of the big issues for certainly the UK and a lot of developed economies is around ageing population, social care, dementia, things like that. So you might say, well, if we're going to reduce the impact of dementia, how do we begin to understand the links between the development of dementia and mental health? Or how do we understand the relationship between dementia and the ageing process and what we could do to prevent it or to ameliorate the problems? So it's only when you begin to start with those sorts of objectives you ask the questions. And then I think, you know, my experience, and certainly I suspect others, it is that once you ask those questions and you get answers, the answers actually generate even more questions. And you keep drilling down until you begin to understand some of the issues. You ask more questions, you actually go beyond the data you've got and try to collect more. So I think a lot of it is about just starting with some basic objectives and having, you know, this vision really of what you're trying to achieve, rather than saying, I think we'll do big data because we've got all this information available.
Paul?
I think I think we're very much all saying the same thing.
Yeah.
It's about having that use case, and I don't think that we need to look for new challenges and new issues. There's plenty of them that have been around for a long time, and we need to find new ways of solving them, either more efficiently than previously or for the first time.
So you'd say that the big questions are the ones we've always had. How do we deal with some of the ageing population, etc.? But how do we ensure, as a second part of that question, how do public servants ensure that they're smart enough to listen? How do we ensure that our public servants, our workforce, have the skills and the capabilities to use that?
For me, it doesn't all have to come back to the public servants. If the data is available and is open to the public can be designing its own solutions as well. I heard about a great example earlier this week when I was in Bristol, where the data's open. They're now offering a matchmaking service where residents that want to cook an extra meal can find someone nearby that needs an extra hot meal every day.
The casserole club? Is that
it's along those lines,
yeah.
But it's asking the residents to find their own solution because they've made the data available. So it's important that there are big things that the council needs to be leading on, but it doesn't need to be doing everything.
What about the issue of open data? Paul?
I think it's something that's been talked about for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And through things such as the Open Data Initiative, we're beginning to see it mature slightly. But again, it's in the usage of that data. So lots of people are saying, here it is, this is what's available. But that's kind of missing a trick for me. That's fantastic because it gives that open access, it gives transparency, which is something that we should all want. But it also begs the question for me, why haven't public sector organisations made a better job of sharing and collaborating and using data between themselves before we even get to this point? So now there's an opportunity for private sector organisations, individuals for that matter, to use, visualise, and play around with these data sets where actually there's an age-old question of why weren't they shared better between public bodies, where some of the real value would have been, and some of the, what would have been early wins.
Why do you think that's happened? What are the key blocks to that? Standards, culture?
I think there's an element of risk aversion. The number of times I've had the Data Protection Act quoted to me as a reason why something can't be done, when in actual fact, if you talk to the Office of the Information Commissioner, you can nearly always do what you're trying to do there. So I think there's an element of using that as a way of avoiding doing something when it's not an issue.
I think different types of public sector organisation often feel that their data or their information is either more valuable or more special, or I've seen lots of examples working in organisations where they're very willing to consume other people's information, but they're less willing to give their own back in return. And I think some of that really comes back to what are we really trying to do here, and what are public services about, which are, it comes down to some very basic things such as improving outcomes, improving the standards of living for people, and very much some of the things that come back to the question asked at the beginning of what is smart and what should a smart city enable.
Going back to the idea of data sharing and open data and stuff, again, there is some investment needed. So how do you get the finance director to enable this, to have the have the skills so that people can share the data, that they understand the Information Commission and the Data Protection Act requirements, etc. How do you get that investment in there? I mean, is there a big hook here? Perhaps fraud, for example. If you use data sharing and big data properly, could you have a massive win on the fraud front? Is that the argument for it? John?
Well, I think certainly the opportunities to use big data for a whole range of things are very attractive, and building what's been said actually, the availability of data now means that public service organisations can work together to share a lot of data that's just been put out there and is available widely, as well as the research institutes. But coming back to the fraud point, I think there are some huge opportunities to use data more intelligently for fraud. So, for example, some of the work that's been going on counter fraud, I know of one London borough, for example, that they started to look at the claims for single person allowance for council tax, and they then matched the data on those properties with information from parking fines and applications from parking permits. And suddenly they found that there were a lot of people paying parking fines and claiming parking permits who claimed to live at places where somebody else was claiming a single person allowance.
As in gotcha.
Yeah, and so they saved something like £1 million a year just through doing that sort of analysis. There's a West Country council that started to look at claims for student allowance, again under the council tax arrangements. It found all sorts of fraudulent student claims. It also turned up a lot of fraudulent universities and colleges, but
that's a whole other story.
So
yeah.
These are individual authorities. When you begin to share that data, there are some massive opportunities, and the public sector's probably got more data than anybody else. Now there are always fears about Big Brother, but once you begin to use that data, the ability to look at fraud issues, and I think you soon realise that actually people that commit fraud on their council tax probably also commit fraud on insurance, housing, and so it opens up all of those things. Now the advantage of the data side is that fraud is a pretty old-fashioned crime, isn't it? But nearly all fraud now is enabled by some form of technology, so it leaves a digital trail. That in turn means that if you can collect that data, you can begin to map patterns, you can look for signals and identify people. So again, I think we're only just beginning to unravel that. And I think the estimate of public sector fraud is 22 billion a year, and of that something like 2.1 billion in local government.
Yeah.
So the potential payback is huge, and obviously that's something that would be attractive to local authority finance directors to public sector generally. And it also, I think when you begin to look at the ways of working across organisations, perhaps helps us to join up and deal with some international fraud. If I can say, Helen, that CIPFA has just set up a counter fraud...
Yeah, I was going to come on to that one
Okay.
in a minute.
I'll hold back then until you're
hold
ready.
back on the fraud bit, on the
Okay.
fraud centre, because there's a stream of questions coming in.
Okay.
Mark Gannon, I think the actual issue is that many public sector organisations just don't have very good information management, so couldn't share the data if they wanted to. Would the panel agree, this is from Spencer again, that sector bodies' primary challenge is that they don't know what they know? And John Sell, irrespective of information governance, residents expect their local council data to be used only for the purpose for which it is captured. It would require a sophisticated educational campaign to move forward from that point. Would central government want to embark on such a campaign? Yes, John, I picked up the local council data bit on that one. Sorry, he sent in a correction on his question. Thank you, John. Can we just tackle those issues before we move on to the counter-fraud side? Because I think, actually, there's some very good points there around fraud. You know, is it an education thing? We've touched on that before. Would it be a big education campaign? Is it the technology? You know, is that all part of Smart Foundations? Matt?
I think this comes back to exactly that, the Smart Foundations. I agree that a number of authorities may not easily be able to access the data they hold, may not easily be able to share that, but that is part of being open for that digital business, to have those foundations in place to start to enable it. And then I think there are issues, I agree, around educating people what data is being used for. But personally, I think that's less of an issue now. I think people are becoming more used to sharing their data online, on Facebook and so on. And so are perhaps not as worried about it as perceived.
Paul?
I was going to make a very similar point, really, that you know, as culture changes, as times change, then the acceptance of data being used for multiple purposes and being open and being free, not only for organisations who choose to release that and share that, but also for individuals through social media, is changing very, very quickly. So, you know, that is an issue that I think will dissipate over time. I think, similar to that, then we also need to look and not just think everything needs to be a big technology implementation. We need to look to join the things that are already in existence. So how can we augment existing systems, for instance, by putting something more agile, flexible, easy to use on the side of big expensive systems that have been in situ for many, many years.
So we don't have to get rid of those. You can just work with what you've got, you think?
Absolutely. And then also, but using also the technologies, you know, some of the most powerful of which is in people's pockets. You know, and we're back to the smart word, but in smartphones. So, you know, such as the council examples where people are able to take a photo of their smartphone of potholes, of broken street furniture, of vandalised signage, and in sending that into the council, there are existing contact centres where people phone in such things, but being able to automatically open a case for that to be dealt with, being able to pass that to the maintenance management system, so something will have to sit in the middle to make that happen, but then also being able to join that up with the technology on the other side, so when that pothole is fixed, or when the vandalism is cleaned off, then again a picture on a mobile phone, you know, to close the case, even send that back out to the individual. It's just joining technology that's already in existence, you know, with some, let's say, smart technology in the middle to enable that, but it's not wholesale rip and replace.
Okay.
I think Paul makes a really important point there. If we come back to convincing the finance director, there's been a mantra in local government of one and done for the last 10, 15 years. When you look at other sectors, the financial services particularly, they talk about straight-through processing. One and done is one too many. It should be none and done. And the examples that Paul's quoting there are exactly that. And that's where you can unlock savings that will attract the finance director's attention.
So savings and the fact that it's not a rip and replace, you can join things up with the latest technologies. And coming back to this whole fraud thing, John, yes, tell me about CIPFA's set up a fraud expertise centre.
Yes.
Because this is a massive issue for the public sector, isn't it?
It is. As I was saying earlier, 22 billion a year on public sector fraud. So what CIPFA's done is set up a counter-fraud team, and what that's doing is bringing together expertise across public sector, and so it's got links with most of the sort of national crime agencies and things like that. So it's beginning to build that expertise, fairly early days, but the logic is if you can use the expertise across the public sector, you can share information, obviously within the legal framework, you can begin to drive down some of the levels of fraud, you can begin to make huge savings and payback. And a lot of counter fraud is about prevention. So the key elements really are, you either prevent, you detect, you disrupt, or you punish. And the more you invest in prevention and disruption, then the bigger the payback, really.
It's always harder to get the money back once it's gone, isn't it?
It is. And,
yes, they've not been successful in that, have they?
And we're now seeing the opportunity. You hear reports, don't you, about banking frauds that take place across borders and huge amounts disappearing. We probably don't know how much money, information, resource is being taken out of the public sector because we probably don't have sufficiently developed detection processes. And I think as the criminals get more sophisticated, we need to get more sophisticated about how we fight fraud and how we drive those benefits across public sector. And if you try to do that in each individual local authority or each individual housing association, it's much more difficult than if you can bring together central expertise, share that expertise, share information through central hubs, share information across public sector. And I think we're at the very early stages of seeing the potential payback from that sort of initiative.
I was just going to say, especially with regard to fraud, then that sharing and that collaboration is absolutely essential, because fraud moves, fraud changes, new technology comes out, new prevention measures come out, new disruption measures come out, then the fraudsters are also, let's say, going through iterative development cycles. They're
development cycles.
They're agile as well.
Yeah.
And to combat fraud both today, tomorrow, the day after that, next week, next year, then the only way to really do that is working together, because people will be learning different things from different experiences, breaking down different fraud rings, different ways of intercepting fraudulent transactions, and that needs to be shared.
What's your feeling from the work of the Centre at CIPFA so far, John, on where is most of the fraud? Is it against procurement? Is it against benefits? Where does most of the fraud, is it internal, external?
Well,
Where does it mostly come
I'm not
from?
directly involved in the counter fraud centre, but my understanding is that a large part of the local government fraud is around benefits, housing, those sorts of areas. I think across public services, procurement is an obvious area where there's potential for fraud, and once you get into the DWP, customs, inland revenue areas, then tax, benefits, all of those areas, and I think until you begin to dig deeper, there's probably a lot of fraud going on that we don't even identify, and so hopefully this fraud centre is going to help public sector to identify it, but also where it's detected in, say, Bristol or Glasgow, we're able to say, oh, well, if that's happening there, then it's probably happening in Surrey or Maidstone, and you can begin to share that knowledge much more evenly.
So you're going to use the big data and the data analytics
exactly.
yourselves, yeah.
And you probably will find that if it's criminal gangs, if they're operating in one local authority, they could well be operating in other local authorities, or they could be operating against other public sector targets. So it's only by building that expertise and knowledge that we begin to fight back. And as Paul says, as the criminal gangs become more sophisticated, more agile, then public sector response needs to be more sophisticated and more agile.
I don't really think I have anything to add there. I think the guys have covered the main points.
So you would agree that it would be mainly from benefits and procurement? You think that's an area?
In local authority, particularly benefits and council tax allowances, I think are the two key areas.
Yeah. Paul?
And I'd agree on those. And it is also joining some of those up. So, you know, if somebody's both within the organisation and then outside the organisation. So if somebody is committing single person discount fraud on their council tax, then, you know, it is worth looking at the status of any residence parking permits that they've applied for. But taking that further, if somebody's even just looking for commonality in the benefits or the discounts that people are looking to claim, then it's not too big a leap of judgment to say if it's single person discount fraud, is there potential for undisclosed partner fraud in the benefit system? You know, they're two very, very similar things. And then housing benefit fraud, obviously that will change slightly as we go into a new world of universal credit. But we're back, from my perspective, to joining up the dots which have always been there. And there's some amazing value, no doubt, and benefits to be recouped by doing that.
Sure.
I think it's also worth saying that a lot of the fraud prevention and indeed a lot of the cyber type risk actually comes down to good basic training. So if there's investment in training staff in counter fraud, in training them in information handling, just being aware of cyber risks, actually the potential to reduce it by people on the front line is huge. So I think we shouldn't think it's all about data and technology. That's a key part of it, but a large part is actually the understanding, changing the culture, creating the awareness amongst staff.
Getting a lot of questions coming in around this, and certainly one viewer is pointing out that regarding HMRC that you mentioned earlier on, the tax gap there is bigger than 30 billion. So there are some enormous savings that could be made. I mean, is that the argument for when you're building the business case for investing in smart foundations, smart governance, etc.? Is fraud perhaps one of the big hooks for getting in an age of austerity, for getting the finance director's attention on this?
I think fraud is a hook, but actually in terms of the bigger picture, fraud's a relatively small part of what smart technologies can do. And
do you think there's a bigger benefit to
I think that actually if you look at, there's a lot of publicity, certainly in the UK, isn't there, about the jaws of doom, you know, as we see the cutback in funding and at the same time social care expanding, you know, how these jaws of doom are creating this huge funding gap. Actually, if you're going to get to grips with that across public services, the only way of doing it is, well, there are two ways. You either stop doing things, much of which we can't do, or you have to be much more efficient. The only way you can do that is by leveraging the power of technology. And if you can move technology to the point where actually you dramatically reduce costs, you make things much more efficient through the sort of smart processes, you know, smart transport systems, the smart technologies we've been talking about, then actually social care, health care, the costs of operating a city or a community begin to reduce. And I think we've spent a lot of time over the last few years in austerity focusing on how do we make cuts. We now need to invest in transformation, smart technologies, and really begin to see the benefit. And I think the real business case, and there is a business case around fraud, but the real business case is you haven't got any choice. You have to invest in these technologies if you're going to deliver the public services that people want in the future at a reasonable price.
Paul, Matt?
I couldn't agree more. The £2 billion for fraud, it's an important pillar in any business case. But compared to the spending on social care and finding ways of using technology to reduce that, it's a drop in the ocean, and that's got to be the key focus.
Cool.
Yes, and I think just pulling some of it together is that the same as when you embark on any strategy or to realise any vision, you need a mixture of tactical and strategic aims. and making sure that the shorter term tactical aims where maybe some gains can be brought in from the fraud perspective, then they should be sequential and building to a bigger picture, which, you know, that is sort of a smart place to live. And, you know, that brings in far much more than just those very sort of local issues to organisations. You know, as we look for smart transport systems, smart buildings being fed by smart energy plants, then, you know, that is national infrastructure investment. In all fairness, it's not purely something that the finance director can do by being cute with his budgets, sort of in a local authority or a London borough, for instance.
But they can certainly start the process.
They're a really important
and
part of it, absolutely. But it's so much more as well.
I'm getting so many questions in. I'm sorry, folks, I can't pick up all of the questions. A couple of interesting ones that have come through, though, is about smart governance. Paul Waller is, we've heard of smart governance, but what about the governance of smart, which is quite an interesting twist on it. So what data is collected, how is it analysed, used and shared, are all political decisions. How well is that understood, and how capable are our political systems in a local democracy are we to make those decisions? Any thoughts on that?
I think we're constantly in a position where the governance of information, the legal system is catching up with the technology. And so, you know, each time we see some progress, people think this is really great, let's do it. And then suddenly they begin to worry about the governance and the structures that fit around it. I suppose one example is if you go back to, I think it was about 2008, prior to 2008, if you wanted to put a parking fine on a car, you had to physically put it on. In 2008, they said, actually, wouldn't it be much more efficient if we could do this using cameras, connecting the images to automatic systems that sent out fines and connected with payment systems? Great. What a great way of driving revenue, automating the parking enforcement process. By 2014, there was a real backlash. You know, our high streets were really suffering because nobody could park, they were going elsewhere, people felt this was unfair, this was all about revenue collection. So in 2014, there was a legal, or the law was changed, or the regulations were changed, so that actually you couldn't use cameras for enforcement of parking fines in that, or parking enforcement. And you know, as you do things and you use the technology, you then find what's acceptable to the public, what's not. And that's just one small example of how we're beginning to understand what's politically and socially acceptable. And, you know, the Snowden affair and all of that has made us realise the wider issues about data that's held and collected and how that's used.
Matt?
I think John makes a very good point that this is an evolving landscape. The technology is moving more quickly than
either society or the law.
Yeah, but I think the role for a local authority in this instance there is not ownership of those open data sets, but it's about convening them and providing leadership. And if big data is supporting the place, the city, that is not just the local authority. The local authority has that leadership role in my eyes, as John mentioned, bringing through the political point of view, the point of view of the citizens, but really trying to act as a stimulant to get things moving.
Cool.
I think new technology, new ways of doing things, and the way that society is progressing very quickly around, as I said earlier, the technology that we just even carry around in our pockets, it does require new ways of governing. And of governance. That may sound expensive and complicated and a whole big piece of work of just working what a government structure or model should be. But I would turn that round and suggest that things need to be tried on a small scale. Maybe not the scale of the digital parking sort of prosecutions, but it's about trying things. It's about discovery. Even look at the government design manual. Look at research, and then we're back to the question of, well, do you have the tools for modelling and things like that? But do some research. Find ways of running, innovative, alpha projects. Try and make those a little bit bigger through beta projects, sort of in a live environment. and then accept that, you know, what you end up with will hopefully give you some strong proof statements, give you a return on investment, and help bolster the strategy that you've been trying to build. But then realise that that's not the end. Then you just, you know, you keep going and going and going.
Going back to the governance, so there's a question here from Dave Hurst. With governance to the fore, how are those responsible for delivering smart services, ensuring that core systems, finance, procurement, HR, etc., are fit for purpose and capable of addressing fraud and other challenges? There's another question here from Spencer Newsham again, saying fraud and error is a missing piece of this conversation, as in error, as in capitals. So the error part of it. So I think that those two questions tie in together. How do we make sure that people understand that? How do we make sure that happens? Thoughts on that, John?
The error bit, I think, is something that we've always struggled with, and really implementing the sort of systems that Paul was talking about earlier begin to reduce the error. So if you move to smart processes, so actually the amount of transfer of data is minimised, so there's no re-inputting of data. You capture it once, it goes through the process, it's recorded. Actually, there's a lot less scope for that error element, and I think all we can really do is, as we move more and more to smarter systems, smarter processes, we try to engineer out as much of the error as we can.
I agree, and I think I mentioned earlier the idea of straight-through processing. So if you take out the manual steps, that's one way of reducing error. I think the second important part of reducing error in a smart environment is allowing citizens, allowing customers to own their own data. So you see a lot, for example, around things like Health Vault in the US, where citizens own their own health data. If it's their responsibility, if they will take ownership of it, and then they will make sure it's accurate for you. So I think there's those two strategies to deal with reducing error.
We're running out of time. I'm getting a warning on the time. So just a couple of quick questions that I'd like to pick up. There was a very interesting comment earlier when we were talking about potholes, and it came in saying, what's the point in having systems that will pick up and report potholes if we don't have the money to fix the potholes? Which is a very good point. On that note, do you think that if we use smart and we get the foundations right and we get the governance right, is there enough benefit in an age of austerity to actually tackle some of the big issues, the fraud, the error, the health and social care issues? Will we be able to fix the potholes?
I think a lot of the approach is around understanding what's important. And if you say we can't afford to fix the potholes, all that happens is the claims for damage to cars, injuries to people increase, and then you say we need to invest more in dealing with potholes because we're trying to reduce these other things. So I think what you need to do is to begin to build some data models that look at, you know, the relationship between fixing potholes and the other claims, and you make decisions. You make decisions about if you invest in, you know, helping older people as they come out of hospital, do you reduce the risks and costs of them going back into hospital? So I think it's not a we can't afford to do this, because that leads you down all sorts of very difficult roads. It's much more about priorities and understanding what's important for the overall good. And I remember a long time ago when I was an education accountant, and somebody had the bright idea that we could save money by not spending money on maintaining schools. So they didn't paint the window frames, and actually that was a great saving. You know, you didn't paint window frames for a whole year, and that was so good we repeated it the next year. The year after that we spent a fortune replacing rotten window frames in schools. And often we end up going down a route of false economy because we don't understand the cause and effect, we don't have the data, and we make what are really quite inappropriate decisions rather than taking a long-term view and real priorities.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I think prevention and early intervention type schemes across all services are often the ones that get cut first because they're harder to defend, because there isn't that evidence base behind them. And I think one of the benefits of that open data, of that big data, might be to start to provide evidence that these will be delivering a return. It might be the return may be some time off, there may be a lag in there, but I think that's an important point.
So in terms of the argument towards the finance director to getting him to buy into your smart visions in the local area, there's enough there, you think, in terms of using big data, using smart foundations?
And actually, what's the point of having a smart city with all these clever systems and that if the roads have got so many potholes in, people can't use the roads? You've got to...
That's not smart, is it?
No.
Your driverless cars might have trouble.
You've got to... And I think part of this is not thinking that the local authority, the public service body, has to own it all. Actually, this stuff is going to happen whether or not public sector engages. So, if you look at most cities, you've got organisations like Uber and B&B that are already, Airbnb that are already changing the way that people operate. You've got citizens engaging and talking about different things. Actually, public sector can't control all of this. What it just needs to do is make the case for where investment's required and put its money where it can get the biggest bang for its buck. And sometimes that's fixing potholes, sometimes it's partnering with the private sector to help them put in the infrastructure to support smart cities.
Any last comments?
I think, just playing to what John's been saying, that some of the things that we've spoken about today, there is a very distinct financial return on them. So both preventing fraud, so putting a front door on fraud to prevent it in the first place, and then also sweeping the fraud that's currently in the system out of the system. There is a financial benefit. There's money being returned to the public person doing that to finance other things. Similarly, when Matt talks about straight-through processing, with the communication channels that we all know and use as part of our lives today, then there is an opportunity to interact directly with systems. To report things, to kick off workflows that get things done. So again, there is a benefit there to redirect those costs towards other things. So a lot of the things we spoke about actually do have a strong financial case. Not all. Some of them are investments in better living and improving where and how we live. But a number would have a direct cost benefit.
Matt, any last words?
I think my only thoughts are that this is happening anyway. And I think it will happen better with local authorities taking a lead in it. But if they don't, it will happen around them. And I think that could potentially lead to more chaos than if they were providing that leadership and governance role.
You've many times come back to the leadership and governance role. I think that's perhaps that's something that we should have a discussion on as a separate discussion, because I think the whole leadership issue is quite important.
I think that is really, I think the local authority should be in that leadership position in a smart place or a smart city.
Okay. We are really out of time. There is one question that came in that I didn't take, which says, can we have some specific examples of how smart foundations or smart services can translate into better services and more savings in social care? Can't cover that one off today, but our next programme on the 20th of March is around smart care. So we've got Kent coming back in, and a few others examples of doing smart care, and hopefully they'll have some examples of the real savings that they're finding. So thank you very much to my panel for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for my audience. And we will be back on the 20th of March, and we hope that you can join us then. Thank you and goodbye.